時間になりましたので、第101回の、東京大学医学教育セミナーを始めたいと思います。お忙しいところお集まりいただきまして、ありがとうございます。本日の、司会を務めさせていただきます東京大学の江藤です。よろしくお願いいたします。本日の、講演ですけれども、パク・ユンス先生から、USMLE 臨床能力試験における、臨床推論能力強化に関する妥当性というタイトルで、ご講演をいただきます。パク先生の、ご略歴を、紹介したいと思いますけど、パク先生は現在、東京大学の、医学部の、ビジティング、アソシエイトプロフェッサーということで、2月末までですかね、こちらで、活動されております。で、もともとはイリノイ大学シカゴ校の、メディカルエデュケーションでアソシエイトプロフェッサーを務めておられるという方で、メディカルエデュケーションの領域における、スタティスティックスの、エキスパートということで、今回ビジティングプロフェッサー、アソシエイトプロフェッサーということで、招聘をしたという、そういった経緯ということになっています。で、この医学教育セミナーの中で、今後もですね、5回シリーズで、講演をいただく、それの1回目ということに、なっています。本日は、パク先生の、ご専門ということで、スタティスティックスなんですけれども、中でも特に、臨床推論、クリニカルリーズニング、それから、コンピテンシー基盤型の医学教育、コンピテンシーベース2メディカルエデュケーション、あるいは総合ということで、すでに多くの論文を発表されているということで、非常にまだお若いんですけれども、非常にアクティブな、研究者ということですね。いうことで、今日も大変素晴らしいお話を聞かせていただけるのではないかというふうに、期待しているところになりますので、どうぞ活発なご議論ですね、非常に貴重な機会かと思いますので、活発なご議論を、お願いできればというふうに思います。So, Dr. Park, so please start your talk.
So thank you very much, Sensei, for this very warm introduction, and I also want to thank everyone for coming here today and for this opportunity to speak to you about some of the work that's been going on in the United States. I'm also very grateful to the colleagues at the center, our IRCME, who've been providing me with a lot of support, and so I'm very happy and grateful for various opportunities to be here in Japan for the next 6 months. I'll be here until the end of February of next year. This evening I'm going to talk to you about clinical reasoning skills and assessment of clinical reasoning skills using patient notes. So if you were attending medical education conferences in the United States, each year, I think during the past 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of popularity around this topic of patient notes. There's several reasons why patient notes have become so interesting and popular, but I think one of the key reasons is because the licensing examination, the USMLE, has really changed how patient notes are being assessed. And so that's really caused some anxiety for medical schools, but at the same time a lot of opportunities. So because it has been a top-down approach, where the licensing examination has made this change, so the medical school has to change how we teach the students, how we assess the students. And so some of my talk will be focusing not only on the USMLE side, but a lot of the effort by medical schools to prepare students for this examination. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So first I'll talk about some general information about clinical reasoning, specifically focusing on what we call diagnostic justification. And here I'm focusing mostly on clinical reasoning for young junior physicians who are in medical school or physicians who are in residency programs who are beginning to develop clinical reasoning skills. mean, if you are familiar with clinical reasoning, the research is very broad. There's a lot of different theories around clinical reasoning, but I'm going to focus specifically on diagnostic justification because that is the focus of what the USMLE is testing. So that's what I'll talk about. And then I will also talk about the USMLE Step 2 clinical skills examination. Some of you might be very familiar with the examination, but I'll also provide some information about the different structures so that we're all on the same page. And then following these two introductions, I'll talk about the validity studies that we've done as medical schools, because the licensing exam has changed, and so from the medical school's perspective, we had to create new assessment systems around patient notes. So we've conducted these validity studies that span about 5 years, from 2012 to 2017. So I'll talk about them and also talk about the validity evidence that we've gathered to support this assessment structure. And then I'll conclude by talking to you about some of the ongoing research that we're doing and some implications. All right, so we'll start with clinical reasoning. And with clinical reasoning, I want to again talk to you about the clinical reasoning process of physicians in general, and also physicians who are junior doctors or medical students. So when we teach them to gather data. Of course, they might come in with some hypothesis at the same time as well. But there is a data gathering stage where they gather the history, physical examination, and they review the lab results. And then they interact with the patient. And then based on that information, they start forming differential diagnoses. And they could rank order some of these differential diagnoses. Some of them might be the top choice. And then that top choice will end up becoming the working diagnosis, and then ultimately they come up with a plan. The question is what happens in the physician's mind from getting from the data gathering stage all the way through the differential diagnosis stage. A lot of the prior assessments, at least in North America, has focused mostly on the differential diagnosis. Did they get the diagnosis correct or not? And for that, the students have done a great job. So they get the diagnosis. But then the problem is that they're not able to support their diagnosis with the findings. So there's a mismatch between the findings and the diagnosis. So the diagnosis listed does not always relate to the actual findings. And about 10 years ago, this has started to alarm a lot of the medical educators. And so how do we improve students to link the findings to the diagnosis? That's been a central problem, and that's where the movement began about 10 years ago. A lot of the medical educators at that point started agreeing that we have to focus on what's called diagnostic justification. And by diagnostic justification, we refer to organizing and using the knowledge that's gathered, collecting pertinent data, and then generating appropriate diagnosis, and then making good diagnostic decisions about the data. So this is a process that the medical educators have really tried to reinforce from about 10 years ago. But at the same time, the problem still remains. How do we assess diagnostic justification? And then how do we know that such an assessment is actually good? What is the validity around such an assessment? So by diagnostic justification, what we're saying is that we're trying to link the findings directly to the diagnosis. So it's this process that we want to make sure the students are able to do, because this is a process that over the course of many studies, researchers have found that students are not doing a good job. So again, they're really good at getting the diagnosis, they're good at getting the correct answer, but they're not able to link the findings to the diagnosis. So there's a pretty well-known study that's been conducted a few years ago. This is one of many studies that's been done. This was done by Reed Williams and Clayman. Basically, they looked at fourth-year medical students, and when you're at the fourth year, this is a year before this is the year they graduate, and towards the end of their fourth year is when they actually take the USMLE Step 2 CS exam. So they wanted to know what is the diagnostic justification ability of medical students when they're at their final year of medical school. What they found was actually quite surprising, because they found out that students did well in certain cases, but then did poorly in other cases. So there's a lot of case specificity. There's also task specificity, which means that they're good at specific tasks and poorly in other tasks. And what was most alarming was the fact that over 20% of the students did poorly or less than borderline on half of the cases. So So this and many other studies have really motivated, not only the accreditation agency, the licensing agency, but a lot of the medical schools, particularly the AAMC, to really focus on how do we train, how do we assess diagnostic justification skills. So this change in terms of the patient note actually happened pretty recently. This wasn't a change that happened a long time ago. It only happened in June 2012. So prior to June 2012, the patient note format only required the student to write the history and findings, write the diagnosis, and then write the plan for immediate workup. But then after June of 2012, which was slightly 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago, they changed this diagnosis section of the note to include ranking and justification of the differential diagnosis. So I'll talk more about what this means, because this was a significant change that happened, and after 2012, a lot of the curriculum in the United States medical schools have changed because of this process. So in the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit about the USMLE Step 2 CS exam, just so that we're all on the same page about the structure of this exam and what's being assessed here. So in the Step 2 CS exam, this is one of 3 tests that the students has to take when they're in medical school. The first test is a Step 1, which is the basic science exam that the students take at the end of their 2nd year of medical school. And then midway through the 3rd year of their medical school, they take the Step 2 clinical knowledge exam. This last exam, clinical skills, is an OSCE exam that they have to take before they graduate. And this must be, the students must pass this in order to enter residency. Most medical schools in the US, I would say about maybe 99% of the medical schools, also require passing the Step 2 CS exam to graduate. So in most cases, this is also a graduation requirement for most medical schools, including our medical school. So what happens here is the student meets with a standardized patient, and they do a 15-minute encounter. And after they do the 15-minute encounter, the student leaves the room, and then they go to a computer station, and they write the patient note for about 10 minutes. So this encompasses one station. And they would do this repetitively for 12 different stations or 12 different patients, and then they'll be done with the Step 2 CS exam. So it is quite a long exam. And so the Step 2 CS exam first is scored by the standardized patients who score the physical exam. This is a checklist that they score in the encounter. And then afterwards, the patient note is scored by physician raters. So these are MDs. The physician raters are MDs who score the note, whereas standardized patients are non-MDs who score they're trained to score the physical examination part. So for medical schools, when they rolled out this exam in 2012, this was a big change because prior to 2012, they didn't really take the patient note part seriously because students were doing quite well in the patient note part. But then after 2012, they weren't sure if they were actually going to do well. And if they failed the patient note part, they would fail the entire Step 2 CS exam, which would become a big problem for the medical schools. So, from about 2010, 2011, a lot of the professional meetings in the United States, AAMC and so forth, began forming sessions around this patient note format and what they're going to do about this. Now, the USMLE, the end score that the student gets is just a pass-fail. So the report card for the student is just a pass-fail. We have no idea how it's scored, on what scale it's scored, what kind of scoring rubric is used, and so forth. And so for medical schools, because we have to teach the students, we have to now design a curriculum, we have to design an assessment, and in the designing of the assessment, we have to also create a scoring instrument to score the patient note. So this whole platform has to be redesigned for medical schools. So that's where the challenge began. So my presentation today is going to focus on what the medical schools have done to develop this assessment system and to validate this assessment system based on the patient note. So this is an example of the patient note that the student actually writes here. So after they meet with the patient, they would go in front of the computer, and in this screen they would write the history that they obtained from the patient, and in this screen they would write the physical examination findings that they obtained from the patient. And then afterwards, what they would do is they would write the leading diagnosis, the leading differential diagnosis, and then from the prior page, they would be able to list all the history findings and the physical examination that's linked to this differential diagnosis, and then for the second and the third as well. So now they're tasked with linking the history and the physical examination finding with specific diagnosis. So this whole part is a new section of the patient note that did not exist previously. Also, what did not exist previously was that now they have to rank order this. This is rank number 1, rank number 2, and rank number 3. And so the ranking also, the likelihood of the diagnosis has also to be incorporated within the student as well. And that is also incorporated to the final grade. The last part is a diagnostic study. So this is the workup plan that the physician develops based on the differential and the leading diagnosis that they've implemented. So this is the full patient note. So this is an actual example of a real student that they have on the USMLE website. So here, a 75-year-old woman with sudden onset of back pain comes in to the emergency room while lifting the turkey from the oven. There's pain in the midline, mid-thoracic area. Past medical history, this lady had a fracture of the bone last year. In terms of her medications, she took acetaminophen for occasional headaches, and so on and so on. So they'll be listing the history here. And then for the physical examination, they would say, well-nourished woman who looks her age, is alert and lucid, appears in pain. There's point tenderness over the T8. And then I think the student performed a straight leg test, and the test was negative, and so on and so forth. So they will report the physical examination that they've conducted and write this here. And then on the next page, they would write the leading diagnosis. In this case, she said pulled back muscle, and then they would link the history findings and the physical examination findings. And then the diagnostic study that they will order is the imaging of the back, imaging study that they ordered. So this is a series of things that the student did. Probably the diagnosis here, this is not a real medical diagnosis, so maybe the student will get a low grade. I think the correct answer in this case was a vertebrae fracture related to osteoporosis. And so in this case, the student will get marks off here, and then probably the justification will also be, will get a lower score as well. So this is the patient note that the student has to write 12 times for every patient that they have to write, every patient that they have to see. So having this type of a patient note format that the medical schools now have to assess on, we at the University of Illinois, we started developing our own assessment structure to help prepare our students. And we did this, and after we developed our own assessment system, what we did was we started conducting research studies on how good our assessment system was. Now, validity studies are based on a framework of these sources of validity evidence. And there's 5 of them. So if you're familiar with validity studies, most of the validity studies in medical education are structured around these 5 different components. Content is the assessment measuring the content that it's supposed to measure. Response process, is their scoring accurate? Are there rater-related issues? Is the inter-rater reliability high? Internal structure, what is the reliability of this assessment? What are the test characteristics of this assessment? Relations to other variables. Is this assessment predictive of future performance? Is this predictive of other performance that's going on? Consequences, are we passing students who should have failed? What is the pass-fail relationship? What does this exam do to the curriculum? And so forth. So this is just a quick overview of how validity is structured in medical education. What we did was we tried to conduct studies and tried to fill them in with respect to these validity structures. And I'll also briefly talk about how we operate at our medical school. So we operate on this education and research cycle. So let me give you an example. So for example, each year in May, we administer the graduation competency exam. So this is a moderately high stakes exam that the students have to take before they graduate. And we do this every May. So very recently, our 4th year medical students just took the exam. This is a 5-station OSCE that they have to do well. It resembles exactly the USMLE Step 2 CS exam. And I would say most medical schools in the United States develop such a graduation competency exam that mirrors very closely with the Step 2 CS exam. And over the summer, because the exam is administered in May, over the summer, we conduct psychometric analyses, and then into the early fall. And after we finalize the psychometric analysis, myself included, we report the findings to the education committee, which usually includes the Associate Dean of Education, various clerkship directors, and so forth. And there's a lot of discussion that they have. They ask questions based on the results that we provide. They ask new questions. We go back and we do the analysis. We report back to them. And there's a lot of back and forth here. They ask new questions. And some of these questions might relate back to how the assessment was conducted, or they might have suggestions for, well, for next year, let's try doing this because our students didn't do so well in this area. Or maybe we should change our curriculum in this area because they're not doing so well, and so forth. And then we try to write up this findings in a research paper, and we try to publish it, and then based on new questions that we generate and new questions, we try to implement it into the next year's cycle. So we've been doing this for various assessments that we have in the medical school and the residency programs for continuing education and so forth. And the reason why we do this is because the accreditation agencies mandate such a practice as well. The LCME, which is the accreditation agency in the United States, has a continuous quality improvement and program evaluation clause that requires, whenever they come for accreditation visits, they want to see documentation of this. So we've become quite good at documenting a lot of this evidence, and then when they come, we give it to them. So this year, actually, we're going through an accreditation visit this year as well. So I'm happy I'm here because a lot of my colleagues are currently working on the accreditation report back in Chicago. So again, this is a cycle that we follow. And the reason why I mention all of this is because this type of process is what really motivated my team to conduct these validity studies on the patient note. So going back again to the patient note, from about 2012 to 2013, and maybe a few years before this as well, we developed this assessment system around the patient note. So this was the developmental phase, and we wrote up this paper. The second paper focused on reliability in the psychometrics, because after we developed the exam, we were very curious about, what's the reliability of this exam, what are the test characteristics. And then for paper 3, at that point, people began asking us, because these things are scored by physician raters, what is the inter-rater reliability? Is there high consistency between the raters, or what is the training protocol that you use to train your raters? And then for paper 4, we focus on the composite measure. And for this, what we mean is sometimes the patient note scores are combined with multiple choice tests. They're combined with OSCE exam scores. And so once you combine the patient note scores with other scores, it becomes a composite measure. So how do you create such a composite measure? What is the reliability of the composite measure, and so forth? And then study number 5 is a multi-site study that we've done with schools in California and also schools in the East Coast as well. So these are continuous studies that we've done. In each phase, we've learned new things, and so that's what I'll be talking to you about. And I think to this day, the patient note assessment structure that we've developed at the University of Illinois is the only one that's publicly available. And so a lot of the medical schools are relying on these studies to improve their patient note and clinical reasoning training in their schools. So for paper 1, now going back again to this validity structure, paper 1 focuses on, we tried to be ambitious, so we tried to cover all 5 areas of validity. In paper 2, we focus specifically on internal structure because we're looking at reliability issues. In paper 3, we focus on internal structure and response process. We're looking at rater-related issues. Paper 4, we're looking at composite measures, so we're looking at internal structure and consequences. Paper 5, we're looking at relationship with other variables and consequences. So again, we're trying to map our studies with these validity evidence structures. So this is the first paper that kind of describes our development phase and what we did with this assessment. This is the rubric, the patient note scoring rubric that was an outcome of this study. one of the things that we tried to focus was the scoring rubric has to be easy for the physicians to use, because the physician has to also score this. For example, in our school we have about 200 students, so they have to be able to score this relatively quickly. And also for the students, it has to provide, you know, some good amount of information so that when the student receives a score, they know what to do about it. So there's some good amount of feedback. So it can't be too simple, it can't be too complex. It has to cover the broad area of diagnostic justification as well. So, so those were the types of things that we had in consideration when we developed this scoring rubric. And when we develop such a rubric, you know, we were looking at the literature, we conducted focus groups, we tried to look at whether the construct that we've developed matched the prospective learners who are in our sample, and so forth. We've also conducted what's called cognitive interviews. And by cognitive interviews, this is an extremely important part of the test development stage, because after we develop the assessment, we recruit faculty and we recruit students, and we tell them, you know, read through the assessment in your mind, don't say it, and then tell me what you think it's asking in your own words. So when we ask the faculty and the students to say it back to us, we know exactly if they're getting the information correctly or not. And then after we ask them to read it and paraphrase it, we ask them more focused questions like, you know, do you think that the measurement characteristics are observable? Is it relevant? Is the wording clear? Are the responses clear? And so forth. So we did the development, and we do the cognitive interviews, and then we launched this as part of our normal graduation competency exam. So if you recall earlier, the Step to CS exam changed their patient note in June of 2012. We launched this for the first time in May of 2012, so that if the student failed, they had at least a month or two to prepare before they actually took the exam. So this was a result. This is some of the series of results that we saw from one of the cases. We have a total of 5 cases that we administered, but this is from one of the cases. So there's 4 parts to the patient note. The first is the documentation. So how well does the student document the history and the physical examination findings? So here, what we found, this was quite alarming to us, was that 1 and 2, one means that a lot of the history and the physical examination findings are missing or they're incorrect. And 2 means that they're poorly documented. And so about a third of the students who were answering or who were writing these notes got either a 1 or a 2, which was really, really bad. I mean, this was, our Associate Dean of Education was very surprised that they weren't able to document the findings correctly. And then we go into differential diagnosis, and the differential diagnosis was written in such a way that we gave a score of 1 if they got none of the correct diagnosis correct, but then if they had half or more than half of the diagnosis correct, they got a 2. So for differential diagnosis, they actually did not that bad, because only about 10% or 11% of the students did not get the correct diagnosis. So we know this from the past, that in terms of getting the correct diagnosis, they're really good at this. Maybe they've heard from their friends what the correct answer is. We have no idea, but they're good at getting the correct answer. Now, if we look specifically at justification, this was what was really alarming to us, because about 40% of the students did really poorly or at the borderline level in terms of how well they justify the diagnosis. So a lot of times what we still found was that they're able to get the correct answer, but they're not able to justify how they got the correct answer. So there's a misalignment between their correct answer and with the justification. And with the workup, we kind of expected to find a low result here, because up until this point, the curriculum didn't really focus a lot on the workup or the immediate next step. So this was kind of expected, and this was one of the reasons why this is only weighted 10 points. The others are weighted much heavier. Yes? Of course, yes.
So you have 4 components.
Yes.
And you allocate 30, 30, 30, and 10 points.
Yes.
And all those allocations decided by like expert panel or
Yes. in the initial development phase, the faculty went through a consensus process. They've allocated 10%, 30, 30, and 10% to the weights. And the 10% was because it's focused less in the curriculum.
And in terms of the justification,
Yes.
You said key findings should be documented to support the correct diagnosis,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Is it based on the key features by Professor Bordage?
Yes. So yeah, that's an extremely good point. I was going to get to that a little bit later, but when the student starts writing the justification, you can begin thinking that they could start writing down a whole list of unrelated justifications just to fill the entire page. And so what we ended up doing was to identify what are the key justification, what are the less relevant justifications. So we tried to categorize them in that order and train the physician raters to classify and to identify what the clinically relevant justification is and so forth.
And such kind of key information is listed in the rubric for the marking.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that's all part of the packet.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification. Yeah. So it is an immense amount of information that the physician rater has to process in going through all of this. And I'll get to some of this later when we talk about the actual rater process, because in the physician's cognitive load of going through all of this, you can imagine some of the students writing all sorts of responses. I mean, even as a non-MD, I look at some of these responses, and it's all over the place. And so it's a tremendous task for the physicians to come up with the correct answer. Also for the diagnosis as well, some of the diagnoses are key diagnoses, differential diagnoses. Others are not relevant. Others are acceptable answers. So we classified everything into what counts and what does not count. Okay. And please feel free to ask questions if you have any questions. So just to summarize some of these findings, what we found was something very consistent with what Reed Williams and Clayman found in that earlier article that I showed. In other words, in our 5-case OSCE that we have as part of our graduation, about 20% of the students did poorly or borderline on justification. This is consistent with findings from Reed Williams in that over 20% of students had borderline or poor diagnostic justification in over 50% of the cases. In our school, we only do 5 cases because of the amount of resources that we have, but in Reed Williams' school, they do 12 cases. I don't know how they're able to do 12 cases. Maybe they have OSCEs for weeks, but they're able to do this at their school. All right, so what do we learn from all of this? Basically, what we found out was that students have to basically continuously practice linking findings with diagnosis. And they have to start this early from the 3rd year of medical school. So as soon as they start clerkship, now that we're making them do this on and on and on. And what we found, now that we've been doing this for slightly over 5 years, was that their performance on diagnostic justifications actually increase over time. So practice is actually very helpful here. I'll move on to the second study. So the first study was mostly descriptive. We were trying to find out how well we developed this scoring system. The second was looking at the reliability and the psychometric characteristics of this project. And so all of these papers, I know George Bordage was here about 10 years ago. This was in collaboration with George Bordage and Rachel Yukowski and others in our team who we've collaborated with. So in the second paper, we were looking specifically at reliability, and I have just a few slides just to talk to you a little bit about reliability before we jump into reliability. So when we talk about reliability, reliability is a concept about consistency. So for example, if you pass on your first test, if it's a reliable exam, you would expect that same student, if nothing happened, and if they were to be retested again, the student has to pass again on the second test. So that's retest consistency. But if the student passed on the first test but then failed on the second test, then that's an unreliable exam because there's lack of consistency. Now, for an exam that has only one sitting, because here they're being tested on 2 different time points, this same concept cannot be applied. So what people have developed is to use what's called true variance and true variance plus error or total variance. I'll talk a little bit about this before I go into talking to you about our findings. So I'm sure after you administer your exam, you calculate the mean and you calculate the standard deviation, and you look at that to look at the distribution of your scores. So that's exactly what happens here. So if you have a distribution of scores, X is the distribution of the scores, and let's say the red line is the distribution of your test performance, the variance is simply the width of this distribution. And so the true variance is simply the subset of this distribution. So if we're able to find the true variance, all we have to do is just divide it by standard deviation squared, and you get reliability. So that's the idea of reliability. So this is just a hypothetical example, just for the purposes of going through this slides. Let's say you administer an exam, and let's say the test mean is 65, the standard deviation is 5. So if you square this, then your total variance is 25. And let's say that through some statistical process, you're able to find that the true variance is 15. So by this definition here, this definition that is just a mathematical definition, reliability is simply 15 divided by 25. In other words, reliability is 0.6. So if you're familiar with things like Cronbach's alpha, intra-class correlation, kappa, generalizability coefficient, phi coefficients, they're all around the same topic. The difference between all of these different formulas is simply how do you calculate true variance. So that's just a formula that people have used. Now for an OSCE and also for a patient note exam where there's many different multiple parts, we cannot use something like Cronbach's alpha. We have to use a much more nuanced approach, which is why I began talking about variance components. So we use what's commonly known as generalizability theory, and applying generalizability theory with 5 cases, we found that our reliability was not very high. It was around the 0.5 mark. Nowadays it's around 0.55, 0.57, but it was around this mark. What was most interesting was that most of the variability was around case specificity. In other words, students did well on certain cases, but did poorly on other cases. And so what that means is that we just need to administer a lot of these patient cases in order to reach a high level of reliability. So in our case, we had to administer up to 15 cases if we were to reach a phi coefficient of 0.7. And the reason that the USMLE has 12 cases is that administering only 5 will get with them a low reliability. So if you do 12, that gets you to somewhere very close to 0.7. So in this paper, we're looking at all of these different test statistics, and we're reporting them on this test statistics. And also another thing that we looked at was what's the correlation between the standardized patient encounter with the patient note? Because here, the student is gathering the data from the patient. So this is a performance-based score. And then here, they're actually translating that information that they've gathered into actual writing. So theoretically, you would assume that if they did well here, they would also do well here, because it's simply a matter of the information that I collect, I'm just going to write it down in documentation form. So what we found was that for data gathering, just when you look at history and physical examination findings, the correlation was 0.47. And when we look at the actual total score, was 0.38. Because the patient note actually incorporates justification and other parts. So the low correlation here actually makes sense. And in fact, the data gathering correlation here was much higher than some of the correlations that was reported in the literature. Other studies have found even lower correlations, meaning that the students did something with the patient, but then they're not able to translate that information into the note. So all of this was quite interesting, because this also means that the student has to collect the information from the patient and then be able to transfer that information in written form.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
So how can you assess the data gathering? Is it do you ask the standardizations or the score of data gathering?
So here for the standardized patient part, there's a checklist that the standardized patient completes. You know, the student asked me about the history, they asked me about did they actually perform specific physical examination maneuvers, and they get a specific score on the data gathering part here. And we correlated, and the patient note has the history and physical examination part, so we just correlate. Yes?
I was wondering whether it is mainly from something missing in translation from physical examination to writing a note, or adding something from their brain after they finish physical examination, so that, well, patient notes has more than physical examination.
So these are very good points. What we've noticed, at least from the data that we've gathered, was that there's more information on the standardized patient because I know that some of you have conducted studies here with a hypothesis-driven approach where you know, the student would come in with a hypothesis and they would do specific hypothesis-driven things. But in the United States, still a lot of medical schools, the student comes in, they do everything. They ask all sorts of questions. So they go with a thoroughness approach. So what ends up happening, because the USMLE still has not changed into this hypothesis-driven approach, was that they actually do quite well on the standardized patient encounter part. And then when it gets to the note, because the student is not able to process, because they just did so many things, they're not able to process in their minds, they miss a lot of things here. But the other way around, where they don't do the maneuvers and they actually document on the patient note, we found a few of those instances as well. And we're still kind of trying to understand how did they miss it and how were they able to get it. There were some instances of cheating also, because they heard from their friends and they forgot to do it, but then they remembered to write it. And so there was some cheating also. So we looked at various reliability-related issues on the second paper. The third paper, at this point, because a lot of the medical schools started using this system that we've published, we've been getting a lot of questions because the schools started using this rubric that we've developed, but then they don't think that the inter-rater reliability was as high. So this motivated us to look at rater-related issues. Again, this was the motivation for that study. Again, I'll just do a quick presentation about inter-rater reliability before I go into the results. So the whole concept of inter-rater reliability is very straightforward. So if you have two raters, it's simply looking at how well do the raters agree. So here, if they're scoring on a 4-point scale, we look at what's the percent of exact match. So here, rater 1 and 2 did an exact match here. They had exact match for 4 of the 10 times. Adjacent agreement is if they're off by 1 point. So here, this would be an adjacent agreement. This would be an adjacent agreement and so forth. Discrepant is if they're off by 2 or more points. And most of the published papers would report these types of inter-rater reliability indices. These are very straightforward. Now, beyond this, you would have also seen indices like kappa and interclass correlation. If you have a 4-point rating scale, there's a 25% chance of agreeing just purely by chance. So if you're looking at things like the checklist, where it's done and not done, there's a 50% chance that the standardized patient would check off something on the patient on the scoring form. So the kappa statistic corrects for these chance agreement. And then the intra-class correlation basically corrects for chance and then also takes into account the difference that the two raters have. So here, if we're only looking at exact agreement, it's 40%, but then there's also 20% of adjacent agreement, which is different from discrepant agreement. So intra-class correlation takes into account what is the distance between the two raters in terms of their calculation. So in this paper, we looked at all of these different inter-rater reliability indices, and to my surprise, because I was expecting to see inter-rater reliability, intra-class correlation 0.3, 0.4. That's what I was expecting to find, because a lot of the physician raters who I've worked with, they complained that this was extremely time-consuming. They spent their entire weekend just doing this, and so they were I didn't expect to find a good number, but to our surprise, this was the number that we found. But this was for the overall total score that the student gets. If we look at specific components, tasks, they actually did vary quite a bit. So the red bars here represent the pass-fail agreement, which was all very close to 90%. But then if we look at the specific score, the justification was also quite low. So what we found here was that not only was the justification difficult for the students, justification was also difficult for the raters to score as well. Because for the raters, they have to process all of this information. Are they linking all of this information correctly? Did they have too much? Is it a relevant justification? Is it not relevant justification? So this was quite low. And so since we found this result, we tried to boost our training around justification as well. One of the other things that we were interested to find out was in study number 2, we found that you need to have a lot of cases to get a high number of reliability. But what if we increase the number of raters? Do we get a similar effect? Because developing a single case is quite an expensive endeavor. I mean, we have to recruit a faculty member to come up with a scenario, list all the details, train the standardized patient. There's a lot of expense associated with developing new cases. So we wanted to know what is the difference? What is the added cost of additional rater versus a new case? So here, the x-axis is the number of cases, going from 5 to 12. The y-axis here is measurement error. So the lower the measurement error, the higher your reliability. It has an indirect relationship. So for this solid line is for 1 rater. This dotted line is for 2 raters, 3 raters, and 4 raters. So when we go from 7 cases to 9 cases, we have a reduction in measurement error of this much. And very similarly, if we were to incorporate 1 additional rater, this additional rater gives a similar effect in terms of reducing measurement error. It's simply going from here to here, or if we're going from here to here. So adding a rater is simply similar to adding 2 new cases in terms of reliability. At least for our medical school, it was a much cheaper endeavor because, as I'll talk later also, the faculty scoring time was very expensive. For example, if we want to hire a surgeon to come in and score something complicated, it was very expensive for their time in developing the case. In this paper, we also describe different rater training protocols so that they can be used, and this is now used quite widely. So now I'll go to study number 4, which is about composite measures. Again, this is a slide just to give you the motivation for this. So a lot of times when I attend clerkship meetings or education committee meetings, the question that I get is, so we have many different scores in our program. We have things like patient note scores, written exam scores from multiple choice tests, OSCE scores, faculty evaluation scores. How do you combine them? And once you combine them, how do you weight them? And what is the reliability of this combined score? So we were faced with the same question for our exam as well, because we know that the USMLE combines the patient note with the OSCE score, and that's what's used to create the pass-fail decision. So we needed to combine this in some way. So let me talk to you a little bit about how scores are combined from a psychometric perspective. So the first way is the most intuitive way. This is the weighted mean approach. So the weighted mean approach is very straightforward in that, let's say you have 2 different assessments. One which is a physical exam score from the OSCE, and let's say this is the patient note score. And let's say you decide to weight this 30% and 70%, and one student got a score of 80% here and a score of 65% here. So for a weighted mean score, this is very straightforward because this is 80% times 0.3 plus 65% times 0.7, and you get a weighted mean score of 69.5%. This is very intuitive, probably what most people would do. Now, the problem with this approach is that maybe the reliability of the OSCE might be really high and the reliability of the patient note might be really low. And by weighting this high, you're not taking that into account here. So this basically assumes that the 2 exams are independent, they're perfect, they have perfect reliability, and you're just combining them. So there's been a lot of studies in the psychometrics literature, statistics literature of how you combine them, and things like that. The most straightforward approach was proposed by Kane, and this is the approach that the National Board of Medical Examiners, the board exams, use when they combine their scores. So it's a very similar process, but it involves an additional step. So first they standardize this score, perhaps into a z-score or a t-score, and then afterwards, with the standardized scores, they calculate the weighted mean, the same way that you calculated here. And then there is some complicated part that goes on here, which is the adjust for the composite score variance. And once you adjust for the composite score variance, you come up with a Kane composite score. And this is what we began using at our school. Now the advantage, again, to using this score versus this score is that the reliability of this score is much higher. It's a much more valid test score. So this paper talks about all of these different processes. So then, after we looked at all of these different components, we went back to our faculty and we asked them, how should we weight the patient note? Because initially, they suggested weighting the patient note 70%, because from a curricular standpoint, the patient note is so important because it emphasizes diagnostic justification, so they wanted to emphasize it. But at the same time, as you recall, the patient note part, the reliability was not very high. So if we were to weight this very high, our composite score reliability is only 0.42. And so it's maximized when it's 40%, but in the end, I think they decided anywhere between 50 to 60%, and also to increase the number of cases. But what something like this does is it gives the faculty some understanding of, depending on how I weight my assessments, the consequential composite score reliability actually is being affected. So this is now put into consideration in addition to the educational and the curricular value of different assessments. We also looked at things like pass-fail classification, comparing the weighted mean score versus the composite score. If you look here, the composite score ranges from 0 to 100. The standardization forces it to be much more stretched out, whereas the weighted score would go from 40 to 80%. So we looked at classification and things of that nature here. So I'll move on to the last study. This is study number 5. And after I talk about this, I'll talk about a few implications, current studies that we're doing, and then I will conclude this lecture. So for study number 5, at this point, what happened was, at national meetings like AAMC and at AMI, we started recruiting schools in the United States who wanted to administer the same OSCE exam at the end of the year. Because we know that they're doing it, it's just a matter of administering the same exam using the same patient note rubric. So initially, we were able to recruit up to, I think, about 20 medical schools, all of the California schools, most of the medical schools in the East Coast to participate. But then when it came down to actually doing the study, there were issues with IRB, schools in the East Coast, the time difference with this, the California schools, there's a 3-hour difference, so it's hard to coordinate all of these time zones. And so we ended up just doing a study with our school and the California school. So that's what's reported here. So why are multi-site studies relevant? Because we try to do this as much as we can, although the coordination is very difficult to do. From a psychometric or a statistical standpoint, you get data that's much more heterogeneous, because if you just collect data from your own school, it's very homogeneous to your particular target sample. So if you are able to do it across many different schools, it's much better. And then from an educational perspective, when we were doing this with other schools in California, we had a better understanding of how they were teaching the students. We had to share cases. And so there was a lot of educational value, not only psychometric, in doing this whole process. So we collected data from our school plus 6 other schools in California. Initially, we also had UC Irvine. We also had UC San Francisco and other schools. They dropped out. We also had schools, Johns Hopkins, George Washington, all these schools also dropped out when it actually came down to the study. So we were limited with these schools, but we were able to complete the analysis. In terms of our main findings, we found that the bulk of the findings were quite consistent, but the interesting difference was that there were school-level differences on patient note scores. So I'll explain this a little bit further. When we gathered the data from all of these California schools, we gathered not only their patient note scores, we also looked at the OSCE scores and scores on all other parts of the exam. For all the other parts of the exam, the school-level differences were very minimal. So it's as if the students in California were the same students at our school because there were no differences in school-level effects. The only differences that we found was the patient note performance. So still even at this time, the way how the schools are teaching diagnostic justification or teaching clinical reasoning, the way how students are writing the notes or expressing the diagnosis are completely different from school to school. And that was quite interesting because I guess OSCEs have been around for such a long time that students are now preparing, the curriculum has become quite homogeneous in the United States, whereas for the patient note, it's still quite different from all of the schools that we've collected data from. And the other interesting thing was we were able to compare data across schools. So, so whichever school number 3 was, they were quite alarmed by their finding as well because their score was significantly lower than the performance in other schools. So doing something like this at least gives you some reference guideline of where your school stands with respect to the other schools. So now I'll just present a few slides about implications and some of the current work that we're doing with patient note and some of the changes that are occurring in the United States. So I've just talked to you about this clinical skills examination in medical schools. So let me ask, why is it so important to create medical school clinical skills examination? Some of this motivation dates back about 10 years ago, where Kate Berg and her colleagues did a study, and it was published in Academic Medicine, where they looked at the relationship between medical school performance to the actual licensing examination. So it was done in 2008, meaning that some of the recent changes were not incorporated, but still they were able to find that for the standardized patient encounter, for the OSCE, there was somewhat of a correlation. For communication skills, there's more of a correlation between how well they did in medical school with how they actually did on the Step 2 CS exam. But for the patient note, there is actually a direct correlation. If they do well in medical school, they're also able to do quite well in the actual licensing examination. All of that meaning, if you're able to catch students doing poorly in medical school, that's a big motivation for them to get early feedback so that they can improve and do better before they actually sit for the licensing examination. And then very recently, I think this was done last year, Monica Cuddy and her colleagues at the National Board, they did a very large-scale study looking at the relationship between the Step 2 CS examination with actual performance in residency. They looked at internal medicine residents. They didn't look at correlations, they looked at more complicated statistical models, but they were able to show that there was a significant prediction between their performance on this exam and the performance in residency. So everything counts, from how they do in medical school, how the assessments are developed, to the licensing examination, to their performance in residency. And they've also done studies linking residency performance to performance when they're actually practicing doctors. So there is some sort of an indirect relationship all the way through. So in the next few slides, I'll just briefly talk about some of the current projects that we're working on with respect to the patient note and with clinical reasoning. So this is a collaboration that we've been doing with the East Coast schools, because the East Coast schools, they dropped out of the project number 5, so they decided to join us on this project number 6. And the idea here on this project number 6 is basically that in the patient note, the student meets with the patient, goes out, they write the patient note. So as the student is writing the patient note, there's a lot of processing that the student does in their mind by writing and typing this information on the computer. So the hypothesis is that now that the student is able to reflect on some of the information, what if the student went back to the patient to ask for more information? What if they went back for a revisit? Because this actually happens in real life. A physician meets with a doctor, and a physician meets with a patient, and then the physician might have forgotten to ask a few questions, so they call the patient and ask for more information. So there is that revisit component that actually happens in real life. So what we've done is we've asked the student to go back and revisit the patient for about 5 minutes. If there's more information that they want to gather, this is a good opportunity for them to gather it again here. And then go back to the computer, and if there's anything that they want to add, of course we've saved everything here, and this is what we actually use to score their final exam. This is more of a research study that we're doing of is there any additional information here that they've collected that would have increased their differential diagnosis, or they've collected additional justification. And some of this is motivated by Jim Blatt's work. Jim Blatt is also a collaborator here, where he found that for the standardized patient encounter, if you allow the students to reflect, they actually do better. And then a second study that we're doing with more medical schools is to train non-physician raters, because consistently, every time we do this each year, the faculty complain to us saying that this is so time intensive, can we train non-physicians to be able to score this? So this was an idea that initially we started floating around, and then initially people disagreed with this idea because they said, this is completely unacceptable. And then after doing this for a few years, they said, yeah, maybe let's start looking at this because it's too time consuming. At our institution, with a 5-case OSCE, we recruit about 14 physicians to score this. And these are full-time faculty, some of them tenured faculty members in the medical school. And just for scoring, so the training and just the scoring part is about $40,000, or slightly over $40,000 in terms of the cost. This excludes any case development preparation. But if we were to apply the same calculation, if we were to use paramedics, for example, or nurse practitioners, or residents, for example, the cost would go down to about $10,000. So there's a substantial cost difference, and our colleagues in California started doing some pilot studies without any training. They gave the same type of information to their nurse practitioner and paramedics, and they found not a perfect correlation, but somewhat of a correlation to look at this. So we're trying to leverage this into doing a much big-scale study. We also have other collaborators who are developing a computerized scoring. So if the computer, rather than the physician, is able to score the note, that might be better. So the national board is investing a lot of funds to develop a automated computer scoring algorithm to score the patient note. So there's a lot of, these are research things. I don't think they will be implemented anytime soon, but these are other things that's going on. This is the last slide. I'll close off with this last slide. Generally, when we do research in biomedical sciences or in clinical sciences, we try to do translational research where we try to continue findings from the basic sciences all the way through making better products or making better drugs or for the patients. In education, it's slightly different. In K-12 education, elementary, middle, and high school education, they have a model of translational science for general education, where they put a lot of investment on the teachers so that the teachers would become better in teaching the students. So once the teachers become better teachers, they acquire more knowledge, they're able to apply this in the classroom setting, and then the students do better in terms of gaining knowledge, they do better in the test. So there's a translational effect going from investing on the teachers all the way through students doing much better. And this is a very well-known phenomenon for general education. So if we apply this to medical education and the health professions, our teachers are like our medical students, and our patients are in essence, they're the students. So in medical education, if we do a better job in training our students, they increase their knowledge and skills, and then they do better in the clinics, and then ultimately it results in better patient and better public health care for the system. So this is T1, T2, and T3, and Bill McGahey and his team at Northwestern have done a lot of work in this area. So today, in today's talk, I focus mostly on the T1 stage and maybe slightly going towards the T2 stage. But this kind of framework is always in our minds in terms of how does our intervention, when we train our students, how does it ultimately lead to better patient outcomes or in the process of getting to better patient outcomes. So I think I have one of the talks later on focusing mostly on translational sciences at a later lecture, but this is the same framework that we will use for that presentation. So I will conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention.
So